I'm not really sure why I chose SpongeBob as my first real series of videos, but here we are. I'm starting from the very beginning too, with SpongeBob SquarePants Legend of the Lost Spatula for Game Boy Color. Released in the US March of 2001 and May 2001 in the UK, this is actually the very first solo SpongeBob game ever officially released, with the first game SpongeBob was ever in being Nicktoons Racing in 2000. That's an entirely different discussion though. Legend of the Lost Spatula was unsurprisingly published by THQ near the beginning of its reign of licensed game tyranny, and developed by Vicarious Visions and Engine Software. If Vicarious Visions sounds familiar, it's because before they became Blizzard Albany, they had been the developers behind things like Crash Nitro Kart, the Crash games on the GBA, and a smattering of other titles of decent renown. Legend of the Lost Spatula kicks off with Bike Bob unicycling through jellyfish fields, as one does, and he happens to find a mysterious statue of a sponge holding a shiny spatula, and I have to question how he never found this thing before. He asks old Mr. Krabs about it, and he explains to Robert Sponge that there was once a city called Palm Bay that was run by a fry cook, but the local volcano, Mount Kabluvius, erupts, destroying the entire place with grease fire. And then, somewhere down the line, the Flying Dutchman finds and steals the golden spatula from the ruined city, and now Fry Bob must go on a quest to retrieve it so he can become the new legendary fry cook. A lot more lore than I expected here. So this is basically a proto-open world / Metroidvania type game somehow. You can tackle things in mostly the order that you like, with some exceptions that rely on you finding a new piece of equipment to open the way. Thankfully in this game, SpongeBob has infinite lives, but not thankfully, he can only take 2 to 3 hits, depending on if you knew to grab the Hall Monitor uniform from Mrs. Puff at the beginning of the game, which I didn't, so I accidentally played the thing on a self-imposed hard mode. With every hit, Strip Bob loses more clothing, much like a lot of other games I play. And if he gets naked, he dies, which you don't want because the checkpoint here is, it's not great. I bet you're wondering how the actual game plays though, yeah? Well, you see, this sponge, this pea stain with teeth, controls like someone soaked his spongy ass in oil and forgot to fry him. This is some of the slipperiest and most unresponsive play control I've ever experienced, and I'm a connoisseur of bad games, so that's saying something. You try to move, you press the button to move, but SpongeBob takes his sweet time responding, usually sending him into an enemy you couldn't see and couldn't react to in time because of the delay in just moving left and right. Having said that, it wouldn't be the most unmanageable thing in the world if it weren't for the other control issues. First of which being this crouching mechanic. It's intended to be used to duck under enemies, but because a lot of these fixed path enemies go wherever the heck they feel like, you get hit anyway. It's also a toggle, not a button hold, meaning that when you push down on the D-pad, SquishBob compresses himself, and you can move around like a cereal box on tiny stilts. It also means that to get out of this rather compromising position, you have to press the up button, which freezes you in place for a moment while the stand-up animation finishes, so you better hope you don't have to quickly stand up. Boy, that would be a shame if you really needed to avoid something quickly in this 2D platformer game, huh? And speaking of the ding-dong dang platforming, we have to address it. The jumping is an enigma that took me more time than I'd like to admit to get used to. The physics are so off here. You jump and have control of direction in the air, but it's so all or nothing that lining up jumps has a steep learning curve. You can jump with all the momentum you can get and kill the momentum with a tap of the opposite direction, or reintroduce the entirety of the momentum with a tap in the original direction. You also have to remember that this is a Game Boy Color era game, so collision detection is kind of all over the place. Why did that hit me? Which means that you don't always land on that ledge you were aiming for, and recovering is near impossible because of this delay in the jump. It takes a second for SpongeBob to go through his windup and finally jump, and usually by that point the enemy I was trying to avoid or the pit I was trying to prevent a fall into has killed me, all because SpongeBob is so unresponsive, I swear he's going down a K-hole. And speaking of enemies, let's talk about that. There's only a few types of enemies that are reskinned depending on the area that you're in. The kind that hurts you directly and tries to attack you, the kind that uses projectiles but doesn't hurt you on contact, and the kind that flies around in a pattern and damages you only on contact. Each of them can be taken out with the various pieces of equipment you find throughout the game, if you can see them far enough ahead of time to actually respond and land an attack, which is a whole other issue. A lot of your attacks have either a wind-up or a range limit, and it's near impossible to tell which item you need for which enemy. So to reiterate, you need to know the enemy is coming already, have the correct item equipped already, and start your animation just as the enemy enters the screen, which by the way is hard. Do you see some of these enemies? Because I sure didn't while I was playing it. So many of these sprites just blend right into the backgrounds and feel cheap. Like, how was I supposed to know that was a bad fish and this was a good fish? The same can be said for a lot of platforms in the game. Some of them look like they're not things you can stand on. Others look like they are platforms, and then you fall right through them. And God forbid you forget to unequip the spring shoes when you're done with them, because it multiplies every problem with this game's controls as soon as you leave the ground. You might be tempted, like I was, to leave them on and jump everywhere because it's infinitely faster than Snail Bob's arthritic walk, but don't do it. You can't even really see what you're jumping into normally, and the spring shoes almost guarantee you're gonna launch your springy butt right into the aft end of something that wants some sponge cake. In case you can't tell yet, I don't like this game, but I would like it if you'd subscribe to the channel, and then you'll be with me forever. Let's talk about something other than how awful the controls feel, by talking about how awful the level design is. Oh, mercy me, where to start here? Being that this is basically, and I really hate making this comparison again, a screwed up Metroidvania, you would think that maybe the level design is where the game shines, but you'd be wrong. Each area definitely does not feel connected in any way, yet they all feel somewhat SpongeBob just as much as they don't. I could go on for an hour about how frustrating each of these areas are just to navigate, but for me the real worst part was figuring out what treasure chests were useless and what ones had vital equipment in them, and then figuring out if that was the only thing of value in the area or not. This entire game feels like a surrealist fever dream to play through, and I don't have much to say about each area in particular, because there's not a real strong distinction beyond a few colors and some changed sprites. They all feel like the same, hard to navigate, cheaply designed death traps, and I know a thing or two about cheaply designed death traps. I will admit that the scope of each of these areas is pretty ambitious for a Game Boy Color game, as is just the concept of an open world-esque SpongeBob game, but we know how that turned out, don't we? I will give this game some credit. The character sprites are amazing. Mrs. Puff has PTSD. Pearl's spine is trying to escape. Mr. Krabs looks like his entire skeleton is trying to hatch. And Plankton is a skid mark that I could mistake for a piece of chicken nugget on my screen.
All he wants is Krabby Patty. Give him Krabby Patty.
These are some of the most cursed official sprites I've ever seen, and oh me, oh my, I'm in love. Another positive, if you can believe it, is the music, kind of. The music actually is kind of good for the first 10 minutes of playing the game anyway, and then it starts to feel like a very sharp object is worming its way into my soft little eardrums. Manfred Linsner, the composer for a handful of other GBC and GBA games, made a little bit of a bop for the bob, and I respect it. Still a bad game though. I didn't have fun playing this, like at all. It was a neat novelty for a few minutes, and then it just became a dull and frustrating ordeal to slog through. The only good thing here is that I got this game out of the way, so if I continue on my SpongeBob streak, it's all uphill from here. I assume. I hope. Either way, let me know in the comments if I should cover other SpongeBob stuff, and like always, I love you all.